actually, Otto Scharmer gave me a little piece of paper that had on it a quotation from Martin Luther King Jr., one of his final speeches to the Southern Christian Leadership Convention, where he said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. This clash between immoral power and powerless morality is the central challenge of our time."
You're listening to the Global Inclusion and Practice podcast, sharing the stories of DEI changemakers around the world. Vivian Acquah and Marjolein Vlug bring you behind-the-scenes stories and kitchen table conversations about the personal perspectives of DEI professionals, representatives, advocates, and allies, talking about what matters in this work and what sustains us in creating lasting change. There are many of us working on creating a more inclusive world. Let's share our stories. We're in this together.
Welcome, Adam Kahane, to the Global Inclusion and Practice podcast. And we are really excited to have you as our guest. And to help our listeners to get to know you better, can you please introduce yourself? Who are you at this moment of time, professionally and personally?
Well, I'm Adam Kahane. I'm from Montreal. I'm in Montreal. I am professionally a co-founder of Reos Partners and author. And well, personally, that's a big story, but I would just say husband, father, brother, 10 grandchildren, lots going on.
I want to dive in a little bit deeper regarding the professional, right? Because you summarized it in just like one sentence. And I would like to help our listeners to get to know you better, who you are, because you're not just an author. The way that I came across your book was somewhere around November, September. I noticed your book, Collaborate with the Enemy, and I was just like, "Ooh, this title it's bringing so many question marks." Definitely in the age of time while Trump just was, elected. It was interesting for me to read this book, but also to get through it okay, this is what I missed throughout my career. And hopefully you can demystify a little bit about who you are when it comes to writing that book, but also who you are in the sense of the different scenarios that you played leading towards that book.
Okay, well, as I said, I'm from Montreal, but I worked in the late 80s and early 90s for a European company, Shell, in the scenario unit. That's a unit that used a methodology for telling stories about what could happen as a way of deciding what to do now. And the big event in my life, or maybe I'd say the hinge in my life, is that in 1991, when I was still an employee of Shell, I was seconded to facilitate a set of scenario workshops in South Africa. For those of you who don't remember the chronology, Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990, but the first democratic elections were not till 1994. So this interregnum of we know things are changing, but we don't know what will happen or what to do about it, was the period that I first traveled to South Africa. And the organizers of that project did something that nobody had ever done before. They organized a scenario team, a team to think about the future, which involved people not just from one organization, in this case, the historically Black University of the Western Cape, but from all sectors of South African society, Black and white, men and women, opposition and establishment, left and right, politicians, business people, trade unionists, community activists, academics. So this was a very interesting experience for me. I'd never done anything like this. I never even imagined it could be possible. And it was very inspiring, this way of working, which as I say, I'd never heard of before. And what was going on in South Africa, this epochal transition. And so by the end of the project, I had resigned from Shell and emigrated from London to Cape Town and married the project organizer. So
that too.
The usual story. And for those 35 years since, we divided our time between my home city of Montreal and Dorothy's home city of Cape Town. And I've written 6 books, and they all start, every one of them starts with that story because, well, it's what got me onto the path I've been on. And in particular, what does it mean, or how can we, or what's the significance of working together with people we may not agree with or like or trust? We may wish we didn't have to work with them, but we find we do. And that in particular is the starting point for the book, Collaborating with the Enemy, how to work with people you don't agree with or like or trust, unpacking not just that experience, but the 100 or so I've had since then in the last 35 years with all different kinds of groups all around the world with my colleagues in Reos. And that's when I said I had another book coming out in November, it's a second edition of Collaborating with the Enemy and 50% new material. So I've spent most of the last year working on rethinking that from the beginning, and I'm really happy you don't often get a chance for a do-over. So I'm happy to have been able to do it over, and it's much better now.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. And I want to ask you something about that later. But one other thing that I'm curious about is, what is a key thing about you that made you say yes to that project, adventure, initiative in South Africa in the first place?
Well, I think it says a few things about me. One is I really am curious. I really am interested in new things. This is, I think, one of my gifts. And I'm willing to do things to learn, or do things because they sound interesting. In some ways, I'm timid and cautious, but in other ways, I'm willing to try something that I've never done if it sounds interesting and safe. Now, people have pointed out, and I think that's fair enough, that that's a form of privilege, that I can try things and sometimes they go well and often they don't go well, and I survive. I don't get locked up or fired or lose my livelihood, and that's fair enough. But I've consistently put myself in new situations, and in all cases, especially when they don't go well, I'm pretty systematic about asking, well, what happened here and what can I learn and what was I missing? And that really is the source of all of my books. If you look at them, they're mostly littered with failures, as I say. That to some extent reflects my privilege, but it also reflects my determination to learn from life.
Yeah, there's something that I thought of, a concept that I learned recently, and it's about having a stood point. And that is the contrast between having a standpoint, in Dutch it's standpunt, a position, a perspective, and then later on realizing actually that's in the past, so it's not my standpoint anymore, it's my stood point, because right now I'm somewhere else. And if I find out who thought of it and it's a Dutch concept, I'll put it in the show notes, I'll reference it properly. But that's something that, reading about you and talking with you, and I was at your book presentation, so you talked at me as well. That is something that stands out to me about you, that you have that space to have a stood point and change your mind and rewrite 50% of your book and re-release it with that new version. That's quite something.
I like learning, and I like finding I'm wrong. It can be disconcerting for a few minutes or a few years, depending on what kind of wrong it is. But I like rethinking things. Amongst other things, I like the intellectual challenge of what was I missing, and what's a clearer or more accurate way of describing this phenomenon. And also, I discovered that way of writing is inviting to others. Even from my very first book, people said, "Oh, well, I realized if you made mistakes and learned and tried things, then I can too." So I think it demonstrates a certain orientation, which is I think is necessary. It's harder for some people than others. Some people are not in situations where it's safe to make mistakes, or it's less safe to make mistakes. But nonetheless, I think most of us are dealing with things that are impossible to get right every time. So difficult though it may be, we have to try things out and see what happens. And all of this is not as easy as I'm making it sound, but I think it's important anyway.
I want to dive into more personal, and that is, how do you describe the essence of what you do? Because you have shared different angles, and I've read like 3 of your books where you approach things from different angles. But how do you describe what you do?
Well, I guess the simplest way of describing it is I've worked for these last 35 years as a facilitator. And I wrote a book called Facilitating Breakthrough. And in a way, I'm trying to redefine and elevate facilitator. It's not just running a meeting. It's not a elaborate form of manipulation. It's a way of helping people work together to affect change or transformation. So that has been my profession, my vocation. That's what Reos Partners does: facilitate processes, design processes, organize processes for people from across the system who may not agree with or like each other, to work together to transform that system. And that's how I've made my living. And that's been the source of, at least the professional source of, the learnings I've reported in my books.
Would you call yourself a change maker?
Yes, with that particular, I would say, very circumscribed role. Participating in change processes in that role is a way of contributing to change and transformation. Now, I think the one important and unpopular thing to say is it's a very limited role. And if you position yourself professionally as outside of the systems you're trying to transform, then you can be helpful, but in a very limited way. And the protagonists, the people who are in the system and trying to, and committing themselves to working to change it, have more at risk and have more influence. So I don't want to exaggerate that role, but I think it's a way of contributing, and I'm happy with the contribution that I've been able to make.
Yeah, and what I'm reading in your now latest book, Everyday Habits for Transforming Systems, is that one of the key habits that you advocate for is to take on the responsibility for the position that you have, for the circle of influence that you do have. And it seems to me that you do take that and you stretch that also by writing these books and by making more change than only being in a room like that and facilitating it, but expanding that. What's your own take on that?
Yeah. Well, the book Everyday Habits for Transforming Systems, maybe more than my other books, is based not so much on my own experience as on talking to people who had a different experience from me and trying to understand what it was they were doing, because it started with a question I didn't know the answer to. Obviously, system transformation is always or almost always a collective activity, not an individual activity, but it begs the question, yes, but what does each person need to do, not only occasionally, but on an everyday basis? So I realized that was the question I started with, and that's what I explored over the period of writing the book and talking to a lot of people who are change makers all around the world. And some of this, it's a very simple book: introduction, 7 habits, conclusion. And some of those 7 habits were ones that I knew a lot about and pretty good at and had written about. For example, the book the chapter Collaborating with Unlike Others, which in a way covers the book Collaborating with the Enemy, is a double click on that chapter. And the chapter Seeing What's Unseen is something I think I'm pretty good at and is the essence of scenario work. But some of the chapters were things that I really hadn't thought about, or not much. And so, and one of them is the one you mentioned, which is chapter 1, Acting Responsibly. And it's a short chapter because I think this question of acting responsibly is more of a riddle than a recipe. So Well, when you say, years ago, Bill Torbert, who's a Boston organizational development professor, told me in a meeting, Adam, that old expression, if you're not part of the solution, you can't be part of the problem. Sorry, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. He said, actually, that's not really the key point. The key point is, if you're not part of the problem, you can't be part of the solution. In other words, if you can't see how what you're doing or not doing is contributing to things being the way they are, then it follows logically there's nothing you can do to change things except from the outside, which, as I said 10 minutes ago, trying to change things from the outside by coaching or forcing, I'm not saying it has no impact, but it has less impact than changing things from the inside. So I knew that idea, but this question of, okay, what is my role, or what are my roles in the situation I'm in, and what does that mean for what I can and must do? And the reason it's a riddle is, of course, we all have many roles. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a member of Reos Partners, I'm a Montrealer, I'm a Jew, I'm a Canadian citizen, et cetera, et cetera. So I have lots of roles. What is my responsibility beyond my narrowest responsibility to myself and my immediate family? And what am I going to do about that? And in a way, it's a kind of question that I haven't often asked. It's a moral question. I think all of my orientation and my writing is hyper pragmatic. In order to do what you're trying to do, how do you need to proceed? And I'm happy with that. But in a way, this question, what is my role and what is my responsibility? What does acting responsibly mean, is a moral question. So it's a riddle, not a recipe.
A moral riddle.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Vivian Acquah, the certified DEI consultant, and I would like to invite you to take your organization to the next level of understanding by collaborating with me. I specialize in helping organizations amplify their DEI initiatives and foster an inclusive environment. Reach out today to learn how I can help your organization unleash its hidden potential and create a culture of belonging. I want to dive into your latest book, because out of the 7 habits that you have shared, which one do you find that you needed to work on or develop more within yourself?
Well, I think it's the one I mentioned, this question about what does it mean to act responsibly? What does it mean to take that question seriously? Is one I hadn't thought about much. And that particular chapter is inspired by a conversation I had with a colleague of mine named Marcia Anderson, who's a medical doctor of First Nations, an Indigenous medical doctor in Manitoba in Canada. And I was talking with her about why she does what she does. One of her roles is as, this isn't the correct title, but responsible for inclusion at the medical school at the University of Manitoba, which is an important institution. And it's pretty difficult work, as I suppose you would know. And I asked her why she did it. And she told a very interesting story, which I'd never heard before, that I relate in my book, about something that happened to her father and how she realized that there was a problem in the medical system in Manitoba, including how it treated brown and black people, and that her father would probably be okay because she is a well-known doctor, but that her responsibility wasn't just to her father. And in telling me this story, she used an expression, a very particular expression that you hear often in Canada and the United States from Indigenous people. She said, well, Adam, it's an all my relations issue. And I'd heard that expression before because we've worked together with First Nations leaders in Manitoba. That's how I know her. But I asked her, what does that mean, Marcia? What's all my relations perspective. And I'm not quoting her exactly, but she said essentially, this means that I need to think not just about the impact on my immediate family, but all my relations, human and more than human.
Which goes into community way of thinking instead of what we are used to in the Western society, where it's more me, my direct family, and that's it.
Exactly.
That's what I care for. Yeah.
Yeah. And in that formulation, it applies also to water and rocks and mountains and other animals, other beings. So I found this very, interesting and inspiring, but also confusing. And I saw her a year after that conversation. We had a book event in Winnipeg that she and I did together. And I said, Marcia, I've really been thinking about this, all my relations point. How do you know what to do? That's a lot of roles. That's a lot of responsibilities. And she gave what I thought was an excellent answer. She said, well, Adam, let's not be romantic about it. There's trade-offs to be made. If I take this part of my role seriously and I try to work with this section of my relations, I'm going to work less with this, or maybe even against others. And I thought it was so her point is, which I made in the book, but she expanded on in that later conversation, is it's not a recipe. There's lots of considerations and trade-offs, and welcome to real life.
Yeah. So what shifted in you after talking with her about that and thinking about that?
Well, what shifted in me is that this is an important thing to pay attention to, not just what do I want or what's best for me, or as Vivian said, my immediate family or my company. And that's not at all straightforward, but I think it's what's involved in being a proper human being.
Yeah.
We need more of that in the world. Just putting it out there.
Yeah. And thank you for naming that. And even the way you said it, it's in your voice as well.
So when you look at the impact that you have created, right? Because you started or you ended with Shell and then set up Reos Partners. What are the ingredients that you can share that shaped your impact in the world right now?
Well, I think this whole question of impact is very tricky.
Influence?
No, it's the same. The point I'm going to make is the same with influence. I did a big project, or I was involved in a big project a few decades ago in India on child malnutrition, a very complicated project involving hundreds of people, and it were lots of difficulties and complications. At a certain point, I became frustrated and confused, and I asked an Indian mentor of mine, a man named Arun Maira, what impact are we having? And he made a point which I had not thought of before, and which I think is important, is he said, that's quite an egotistical question, Adam, that you're concerned with your impact. And he quoted to me something that he's quoted to me in different contexts 5 or 6 times. He said, Adam, remember the last stanza of the 2nd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where it says, the work is yours, but not the fruits thereof. I mean, that same statement is made in lots of different spiritual texts, but that you do the work that you think you need to do, you act responsibly, and you don't know what the impact will be, and you certainly can't control it. Now, there's just a wrinkle on this in the past few days. It's possible to conclude from that, I'm just going through the world. I don't know what my impact is. Might be nothing. But I was talking about this with a friend of mine a few days ago, Betty Sue Flowers, and she said, she made the same point from the opposite perspective. She said, well, Adam, assuming you have no impact is also quite egotistical. That, you're not really taking account of, what other people have done as a result of the activities you've participated in. So I don't know about impact. I mean, I'm doing what I think is my job, is my responsibility, and And I hope it's useful.
It's very humble of you to answer the way you did just right now. And that's also the way I have gotten to know you through all these Zoom conversations about the upcoming book. And it's humbling and grateful to see a person, in my perspective, who has such a positive influence on how people can work better, how people can see things from a different light, but also how can we humanize our approach in collaborating? How can we humanize facilitation? How can we not only look towards war, but also see the love that is connected with that? So I need to share things from my perspective. I see you having a lot of influence, and with influence or with power comes great responsibility, and the way that you carry that responsibility is admirable. That's my things from my perspective.
Well, thank you.
And I certainly hear you having intentions and ingredients for that, even when you can't fully control the impact that they create. That's my impression. And I'm reminded of the African philosophical concept of Ubuntu as well, where I'm not an expert by any means, but Ubuntu, briefly summarized, I believe, is I am because we are. That you're always part of a we and a whole. And yes, the impact of that is both greater and smaller. It's humbling, but it's also very wide, and both at the same time. And I love that that's what you picked up in Manitoba and in India. And it's quite a global perspective in that way.
Hey, are you ready to rediscover focus, clarity, and resilience so that you can be a stronger change maker for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? I am Marjolein Vlug. I'm a certified coach. And whether you're getting started in DEI or are further along in your journey, I can support you to take your work to the next level. With me as your ally, you can gain clarity on your next initiatives or career goals, make intentional choices, stay accountable to them, deal with the intensity of the work, and create real change. Let's talk. I'd love to learn more about you. Reach out, book a chat.
There's another habit that you wrote about that is something that we have focused on so far in our podcast around, well, your habit is persevering and resting. And I've been asking all our guests so far, like how do you do that? How do you persevere? How do you rest? How do you take care of yourself while doing hard things? Certainly, working on big things with global impact, deep stuff, complex conversations, facilitating those with opposing perspectives. You need to rest to be able to persevere. How do you stay grounded in this work? What is your way of persevering and resting?
Yeah, that chapter's interesting, or that habit's interesting, because many people, especially activists, have said that they really appreciated this chapter and the double invocation of persevering and resting. And I think it's important, although I don't think it's very complicated. It seems to me sort of obvious. Like all of these habits, it may be obvious. That doesn't mean it's easy. And again, I'm aware that I have a certain privilege that allows me, in general, the work I've done has not been dangerous to myself, and in some ways has been very well protected work in lots of respects. So, and I've always been very intentional about resting. I'm somebody with very strong boundaries. I'm taking the summer off. Don't call me for anything. And there's ways in which putting up such big boundaries and fences around yourself has negative as well as positive implications. But I've always been very intentional about that. And I just say two practical things. One is that I can see how when I don't do that, when I'm not rested, when I'm physically tired or stretched or stressed or anxious, my work is really much less effective. So it's, the work I do requires you to be very alert and present and able to see what's going on, said and unsaid, visible and invisible, to feel what's going on and to make adjustments, including in situations where lots of other people, where everybody else is anxious or jumping up and down. And the many times when I've been stressed or tired or anxious, my capacity to do that is much less. So at least in my, and the same's true in my personal life when I'm upset or triggered or anxious, make all kinds of mistakes that impact other people. So
there's impact again.
Yeah. Well, I do things that affects other people. The impact it has on them, I guess, is to some extent in their hands as well as mine. But anyway, so that's one thing. But the second thing I'd say is that for many years, I taught on a wonderful summer program in Halifax, Nova Scotia, called the Shambhala Institute for Authentic Leadership, which was a social change school led by a group of Buddhists. Went on for a long time, doesn't happen anymore, and had a big enthusiastic group of students of all ages, and people would come up to me and ask me exactly the question you asked. What is your personal practice for doing this work? And I know what they wanted me to say, which is that I have this or that meditation or spiritual practice, and I was a little uncomfortable with the question because I don't. And I used to give an answer which was a little flippant at the time. Or I used to give an answer at the time which was flippant, which is I would say, well, I try to be well rested and to keep my bowels moving properly. And I could see every time that they were really disappointed, that they were expecting something more elevated. And I felt a little foolish for having made such a flippant comment. But when I thought back on it, I thought, actually, that's good advice. That's good advice. Try to take care of yourself and be properly, grounded in all physical and mental and spiritual respects. It doesn't have to be something complicated or esoteric, but take care of yourself, because if you're, out of balance in any dimension, seriously out of balance in any dimension, you're not going to be of much help to other people, and you're not going to be able to do your job. So I now think that wasn't such a dumb answer.
Yeah, not at all. And even with what I'm currently reading, I've been reading about literally gut health.
Exactly.
And how that's related to depression, for example. That really made total sense, even though people didn't realize it at the time. It's good advice. And I'm hearing your habit of having those boundaries is well developed, and you're luckier in that respect. You're more privileged, and also just more, that's a great talent that you've had for longer. That's important too. I was just reading a new book by Reshmi Nashir. I'll put it in the show notes. And she said something along the lines of, rest is where you find more truth. And I think that's a great enabler as well. Yeah.
Well, maybe I can go back to something Vivian said a while ago, because one aspect of this that I've thought a lot about and written a lot about is the extent to which there's two things that are opposite and both true. So one is what's implied by the idea of Ubuntu, that I am that each of us is part of a larger whole, larger wholes, plural. I'm part of my family. I'm part of Reos. I'm part of this trio doing this activity for 1 hour together now. I'm part of, the village I live in, etc. And so I'm part of larger wholes, and all my relations, reminds me to be conscious of my relationships with others. But it's also true, I think, that I'm a whole in myself. And you can describe that as a Western or an individualistic point of view. And I certainly have that very strongly in my culture. And that's where the boundaries come in, and me, having a sense, I don't know whether it's biologically 100% accurate that I'm a whole in myself, and both are true. And I've been inspired to think of and write about that by a sentence I read several decades ago. Actually, Otto Scharmer gave me a little piece of paper that had on it a quotation from Martin Luther King Jr., one of his final speeches, so the Southern Christian Leadership Convention, where he said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. This clash between immoral power and powerless morality is the central challenge of our time." So I've really dug into that. And in particular, it's, sometimes you just read something and it strikes you as, this is important, pay attention to this. And I didn't want to misinterpret what King was saying because, just taking one sentence out of context. But when I looked into it, I realized he was almost certainly using those words in the sense of one of his teachers, Paul Tillich, who was at the time a well-known German-American Protestant existential theologian who wrote a book called Power, Love, and Justice, completely impossible book to read. I'm interested in it not because I'm super interested in German-American Protestant existential theology. It's actually not really my thing, but the definitions he gives really explain so much of the work I'm doing. And so I relied on them over and over. What is power? What is love? And what is justice? Which I now understand to be the form of the relationships amongst us that enable everybody to express their power, their drive to self-realization, and their love, their drive to connection. So I just want to say, for me, the fact that we're part of larger wholes is only a third of the story. And I think we need to be balanced in paying attention to all three. And in Tillich's words, all three are love, the drive to unite the separated, power, the drive to self-realization, and justice, the form of the relationships amongst us. So that's really been the core of my theorizing about this work. And because I think most people choose to pay attention to only one or two of those, they end up with a practice which I think is dangerously unbalanced or problematically unbalanced.
Yeah, it's a three-legged stool where you need all three.
Interesting to see how this unfolds throughout the upcoming years. I want to learn about the things that light you up, right? Because throughout your books, you've mentioned different...
Sorry, Vivian, just one. I apologize for interrupting. Please come back to that in 30 seconds. But I just want to remember to say, so when I read the title of your podcast, Global Inclusion, I think that's it, right? Or those words are there.
Yeah, Global Inclusion in Practice, yes.
So so I'm really interested in that. And in a way, all of my work has been how to include actors from across the system, including people who are marginalized or oppressed by a system. And at the same time, I think we need a boundary around inclusion. The idea that we do everything with everybody on the planet. Well, we don't. I'm from Montreal, so I have to quote Leonard Cohen at least once in every podcast. And he has a song where he says, "Although all may be one in the higher I, down here where we live it is two." So in the higher I, we're all one, and we have to have global inclusion. But down here where we live, there's boundaries. I'm going to include these people in this, and I'm going to exclude these people. But for this other thing, I'm going to try to work with these people, but not these people. So I wanted to make a connection between this idea of boundaries and power on the one hand, and global inclusion and love and all my relations on the other. To me, that's a central tension in this work, where when it's skirted over, we get into all kinds of confusions and dysfunctions.
Yeah, it makes me think of what you just said about, Marsha Anderson said about the trade-offs that need to be made. Mindful trade-offs, in a way. Would that sum it up?
Exactly. No, exactly. Yeah. Sorry, Vivian, you were asking. Yeah.
No, but also I want to come back to what you shared just right now, because this is one of the reasons why we want to do our best to interview different people from different places in the world, because the way inclusion is interpreted in Europe is different than the way inclusion is interpreted in Canada or in Africa, right? Or maybe even in New Zealand. So having those diverse perspective of what does inclusion mean to you, and what does it mean to be a change maker, and how do you rest and restore? How do you brace yourself, or how do you recharge yourself? You never know who you may touch, but also you never know the cultural dynamics, the background, the way things are, the way things used to be. They change, right? Words that were, let's say, 30 years were normal are now being excluded or now being canceled because of the fact that they are not inclusive anymore. And that connects also to what you were sharing right now when it comes to global inclusion. You cannot please everybody, but you can be considerate. You can create a way where you collaborate with your colleagues, because I don't like all my colleagues. And I'm sorry to admit this here on this podcast. I like you as a friend, or I like you as a colleague, but that doesn't mean that I love you as a friend or as a colleague, right? So this is an interesting dissection, Adam. And I'm curious about what lights you up.
Well, I'm in a transition phase in my life. Things look different at 65 than they did at 45 or 25. But I'm, I don't know if I have a good answer to that question. I'm enjoying being with my family. I'm enjoying thinking and writing. I'm enjoying running. I'm enjoying cooking.
Regarding the cooking element, though, because one of the things that caught my eye was in your newsletters, you always share some kind of a magnet of a country, and oftentimes it's connected with food. So maybe you can share a little bit more about the why behind you capturing that element and sharing that with all of us.
Yeah. Well, it's true. In the book club that you've been a generous member of, I sent out, 20 emails, and I did include in every one of them a photograph of a magnet. And you're the first one who actually, or only the second one who's ever mentioned it. So I thought it was a little strange. But yes, I have, for silly reasons, a very large collection of magnets, all of which are magnets of food from different countries.
Yeah.
I like food, and I like food from different countries. And I started this collection, which is now very large. And I put it on the emails just to be playful and personal rather than only professional, but nobody ever comments on it other than you. So thank you.
There's a thing that you don't know about us, especially me, is that I have learned throughout my grandmother that food is a way to connect with people. I haven't seen anybody that said, I don't like food and I'm not going to eat with other people. So a way to break barriers is breaking bread with each other.
Nice. Yeah, thank you. Beautiful.
So the first time I saw that magnet, I knew, and the second time, and then it was, it was known that, okay, I have a foodie.
Yeah, I don't think there's ever been an episode here where food has not come up in the conversation. It's part of the space, and you get it. In addition to food, what are other people that inspire you? You've come across loads of people. Who is currently an inspiration for you?
Well, I guess I'm inspired or impressed by lots of people. So many people do things that I think are important that are completely different from what I do and that I appreciate. I guess maybe give a non-obvious example. I'm inspired by our political leader, or by many of our political leaders. I think it's a courageous thing to do. And whenever I look at political leaders, ones I agree with and ones I disagree with, I'm impressed at their energy, and I don't know how they have so much energy. So, and that's true of lots of people. Your former prime minister always popping up about NATO, and my current prime minister, and the South African president, the U.S. president for that matter. I'm just amazed that people have so much energy and are trying to do something in the world. As I say, I may agree or disagree, admire or detest, but I'm impressed by our political leaders. And so I don't have the view that, well, politics doesn't matter and, all these politicians are scoundrels. I think we need people to play those roles. And the fact that it's becoming more difficult to play these roles and that good-hearted people are being chased away, for me, is a real problem. There's a very famous Canadian who died the day before yesterday. You might not have heard of him. His name was Ken Dryden. He's famous because he was a hockey player. I'm not a big hockey fan, but he was a really famous hockey player. And so there's been a lot of obituaries of him on the radio. And in one of them, he said the odd thing about being a hockey player is you retire from that in your late 20s or early 30s. Well, as an athlete. So retirement is not just something for people in their 60s or 70s, but at least for athletes. And he went on to become an author and a politician and a member of the cabinet. And I met him once in a project I did on Canada. So I'm reminded of what a great human being he was across all these different dimensions of his life. He did an extraordinary thing. He was interested in education, or concerned about schools. And in his, I don't know, I guess his 50s or something, he went back to high school for a year to write a book on it.
To experience.
Wow.
To experience it again. I thought, wow, this guy's serious about really trying to understand what's going on from the inside.
But that's empathy, right? Literally walking a mile in the other person's shoes. And
yeah,
and
it brings
curiosity put into practice and perseverance as well.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
No. So Ken Dryden is the person I'm inspired by this week.
We'll add some notes about him and maybe a good obituary as well in the show notes for other people to read.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
What would you like to explore looking ahead? So you mentioned your research project, but I'm curious also, what are the other things that you would like to explore looking ahead?
Well, I was saying before we started the recording that the book Everyday Habits was published in April, and I have this very much revised second edition of Collaborating with the Enemy coming out in November. I guess around the time this podcast is published, and we should put the link to that in the show notes as well. But for my sins, I'm also thinking ahead about other writing projects, and I do think. If I think back to everything I've worked on and everything I've written about and everything I've lived, I'm thinking this question about the character of the relationships we have with others is really central. I mean, it's obvious, but it's central. And this distinction between engaging with others, in the book Everyday Habits, I call it radical engagement, but engaging with others, this is an odd phrase to use, but taking other people seriously. I don't mean being serious, meaning, a big frown, but I mean treating them as recognizing that they are wholes in themselves. We may agree with them. We may not agree with them. We may want to fight them. We may even want to destroy them, but taking them seriously as beings versus not, versus saying they don't matter, or they're inferior, or they're not even really human, or they're just the same as me. So I'm thinking about that these days, and I'm thinking that that's something obvious, but really not straightforward. There's a very good interview of Brené Brown in the New York Times this week, and she says, this isn't an exact quote, but she says, she's talking about her work coaching leaders, and she says at some point, being a leader means having 10 really difficult conversations every day. And I thought, well, yeah, that's true. This is really not work for the faint-hearted.
Yeah, and curiosity and perseverance are helpful, I assume.
Well, curiosity, but also courage. I was thinking of a CEO I knew a long time ago. He's actually a Dutch CEO. His name's Tex Gunning. I knew him when he worked for Unilever, but he went on to be the CEO of, I think, Akzo Nobel and several European and Dutch companies. I can't remember whether he's retired now. But I met him a long time ago, and he struck me as one of the most powerful and courageous and harsh people I ever met. He was willing to just we were working on a project. We've been working on it for months, and he thought the results. We presented the work to him, and he really thought it was terrible results, and he wasn't polite about it. He just said, "This is complete bullshit. Nothing in this makes sense. I'm going to make the decision I think is required." And at the time, I thought it was terrible, and I was very upset, and I sulked about it for months. But I'm also admiring of that willingness to do what you think is correct, even if it's not sweet as I would like people to be.
Yeah.
Dutch directness.
Yeah. We were talking about radical candor earlier and about that blunt directness and just saying the thing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I've worked a lot in the Netherlands, as you know, and in general, I think that Dutch people are not particularly direct. They're just rude. I have a little hobby is to see how many times, and I've succeeded 3 times in my life of having a Dutch person say to me, "You are very frank." So
you managed 3 times.
I've managed 3 times. So I don't think Dutch people are especially frank, but they are willing to be. I guess if I take that text gunning, I think the grain of truth in that is more than some other cultures. They are willing to be rude, and that's not always a bad thing.
Yeah, true.
Back to you. Who are you growing into?
Well, I'll answer it in a roundabout way. I've been thinking a lot about my father these last periods, Bernard, who was had his own troubles and was quite a not tough or mean, but a hard and protected person. At least that's my memory of him growing up. And what was very dramatic is in his later years, he softened enormously. And I really noticed that and was impressed by it. So I hope I'm growing into that aspect of my father.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, thank you.
It was an amazing conversation to have this with you, but also to learn more about you behind the scenes than in front of the scenes, right? I hope that you enjoyed this conversation.
Yes, thank you. And sorry, just to go back a second, but I think it's a useful connection. One of the things Tex Gunning did, which I thought was very impressive, I'm now remembering it, and it's related exactly to what we're just talking about. He was once leading a meeting of people who'd never met. And he started the meeting by saying, well, we could go around and everybody could introduce themselves with, their name and their title and their official biography. But I want to do something different. He said, turn to the person next to you, tell them about your mother and father and what you learned from them. And I just remember, I was a participant in that meeting, that the meeting went from here all the way down within a matter of a few minutes.
Yeah.
In a beautiful way. So yes, there's a human connection. Everybody's got a mother and father, even if they didn't know them, and that all our mothers and fathers influence us, and that's a point where we're all the same. And I thought it was a very stunning, and I'm remembering it as the other side of Tex Gunning, and maybe those 2 images of Tex are worthwhile to leave you with.
Yeah, and as a whole person that he was and that everybody is. Thank you. We will be using the habits in your book, Everyday Habits for Transforming Systems, throughout this season to talk with other guests about, because we've been learning so much about how all of these are important. And we've mentioned a few of them in this conversation, but there's more, and we warmly recommend this book. What's a key piece of advice that you would like to end this episode with for other change makers to remind them of?
Yeah, I guess what I'd like to remind you of and leave you with is one of the chapters which is about something I hadn't really thought about, is the chapter on working with cracks. And that word, or that metaphor of cracks, it turns out to be very evocative. Lots of people use it, including Bayo Komalefe, but many people have picked up on it, and I've found it really productive. So I invite people to think about cracks. And again, there is a famous Leonard Cohen quote. When you write a book, you can't include song lyrics at all, not even one sentence. You run into insurmountable copyright problems. So I had to take this song out of the book. But of course, the famous line from Leonard Cohen is, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." But when I looked at it again, when I looked at the song lyrics again, I realized that the couplet before that is maybe even more interesting. He says, "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering." And this idea that every single one of us has bells that we can ring that are within our reach. They may be hidden, they may not be obvious, they may be unfamiliar, but there's something every one of us can do within our reach. But what it requires is to forget your perfect offering. Forget or abandon the hope that it will be perfect, or we know what will happen, or our collaborators will be perfect, or we will be perfect. We have to forget this. So that's what I'd like to leave you with. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. You're warmly invited to pause for a moment and think about what stood out to you from this conversation. Please share this episode with others to inspire them too. Make sure to subscribe to our Substack channel. We'll be back soon with more episodes. Be well, take care, and stay connected.